Good afternoon and
welcome to this, our first in a series of 3 COVID-19 Transforming the TV Industry webcasts. As with all industries, COVID-19 has forced a huge shift in the TV space. We wanted to explore this further, delving into 3 key areas: entertainment, viewers, and consumer electronic devices. And we're going to do that by firstly looking at the impact on entertainment today. I'll come back to that. Viewer behaviours next Wednesday, and then finally in this series of 3, staycation and the consumer electronics device. At the end of all that, in the following Wednesday on the 6th of May, we're also going to present a State of the Nation for UK digital television innovation, a piece of work that's been in train for some time, and we'll look at the kind of broad economic and social impact of television to viewers and the economy in the UK. But first to today, I'm very fortunate to be joined by David Sidebottom, who's Principal Analyst for Media and Entertainment at Futuresource Consulting, and Kauser Kanji, who's Managing Editor of VOD Professional, reporting from the future of TV. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to David, who's going to take us through the COVID-19 impact on entertainment. David.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thanks everyone for tuning in today. The deck, I think, will be made available afterwards as a resource, so if you do want to follow up afterwards directly, then please do get in touch. So obviously it's been a pretty strange few weeks. That's something we can all agree on. And whilst there's been a lot of concern across a whole number of areas, I think one area where we've seen some intriguing developments is that of entertainment consumption, and in fact that of the wider TV and video landscape overall. Whilst we've seen a number of positives, obviously on the other side there's been some negative impactors on the overall marketplace and also on consumer behaviour as well. So I'm going to spend the next 20-25 minutes or so going through sort of our take on where we see some of the bigger impactors, some of the bigger changes we've seen over the last sort of 4 to 5 weeks, and also wrapping up is where we see this heading when we come out of the lockdown. Now, will some of this behaviour carry over? What are going to be the implications in the second half of this year and 2021 and beyond, as invariably we will likely to enter a recession. So we'll touch on all those subjects. You have the question functionality as well, so please feel free to drop questions, and Richard will field them around sort of halfway through. We'll take a break to field some of those questions. So in terms of the overall impact, I think it's fair enough that the lockdown related to COVID-19 has had a considerable impact across all elements of the supply chain, not least on the production side, but also through the delivery, on the channels and services and distribution, and then finally with audiences as well. We're seeing different levels of change, very rapid change across all these elements. If we look on the production side, for example, we've seen a combined £250 million in production cuts from the ITV and Channel 4 announced. We're seeing that across all areas of other companies as well, not least from a cost-cutting exercise, but also just the ability to shoot and produce content at the moment is proving incredibly challenging. I'll come on to that in a little bit more detail shortly. On the delivery side, again, something we'll touch on in more detail further on. There was concern early on that with everyone staying at home, would the networks be able to cope? We've actually seen, BT seen a 45% increase in broadband traffic during the lockdown period, but it's way off the capacity of the networks. There's much more headroom before it becomes an issue. So we're now well within our means still of being able to deliver all these additional streaming services. On the channel and services side, from linear television through to broadcast VOD services, through to premium streaming subscription services, we've seen a marked increase in consumption on all of those platforms. Perhaps one of the most intriguing and timely examples was the launch of Disney Plus on the day of lockdown. I think 24th of March was the first full day of lockdown. which really provided a very timely boost for its financials. Now, since the UK has been in lockdown, we estimate that there are now 5 million new SVOD subscriptions in that period. In fact, it could be closer to 6 million. That's something we'll be keeping a very close eye on moving forwards. And in terms of audiences, now there's varying data around this. Barb suggested that we saw a 16% increase in the week before lockdown year on year. More recent data suggests that that could be more in the 25 to 30% increase in overall audience viewing. So across the board, we're seeing these very quick changes, and we'll go into more detail about these over the coming slides. But all this has an impact, and in particular on revenue and overall spend in the industry. We're seeing perhaps an overall increase in some areas on consumer spend, but other areas are going to be hit, as I'll go into more detail shortly. This interesting paradox we have of consumption being up significantly, but advertising spending down, and clearly we expect that to continue during the near term. And that is perhaps the biggest concern for the TV industry overall, because it has a knock-on effect on production, on broadcaster revenues. There are some services which are a little bit more protected to that, but overall that is perhaps the biggest concern we're seeing across the TV industry right now. And obviously the impact on program sales as well. If you aren't able to shoot, aren't able to produce that content, then it will have a knock-on impact further down the line of being able to actually sell that content to third parties. So whether that's broadcasters or independent content producers, that's something we will see come to the fore perhaps in the second half of this year. So in terms of audiences, as I mentioned, the UK TV was up 16%, and now will be even more than that. In France, we've seen TV viewing increase by up to 45 minutes a day to 4 hours 29. So that's a fairly significant jump overall. And in Italy, which obviously has been in a lockdown for longer, they've seen pretty much week on week a steady increase in TV viewing. They're actually watching 50% more TV per week than they were in early January. From a production side, as I mentioned, we have seen not just the social distancing side hit production. Things like Coronation Street, for example, has now ceased. So we're seeing perhaps some more intuitive and clever scheduling going on from some of the broadcasters, but also some of the streaming services. So content which has been recently being produced, which is yet to hit channels or services, will now effectively need to be spread out over the space of 2 to 3 months. So we expect we will see a decline in this type of content over the next few months. Some shows, however, have been well suited. Things like Gogglebox, for example, can continue with no change to their format, yet it still remains effectively near live and relevant. We've seen other programs like Have I Got News for You, for example, try to amend their formats to do it remotely. And so it perhaps, again, takes a little bit more imagination from the viewer to really delve deep and get into that show. I think thirdly, related to this, is that we're seeing consumers almost discover new genres, things which they wouldn't have tried before, perhaps on platforms they're less familiar with. So a good example of this is obviously Joe Wicks, which on its first day of the lockdown on the 24th of March, he hit 1 million live streams, or almost 1 million live streams. Now, I don't know if any of you have tried Joe Wicks. My advice would be, do it once, you will pull a muscle which you never realised you had, and then you don't need to do it again for 2 weeks. So in addition to that, things like esports and virtual racing. The Bahrain Grand Prix was broadcast virtually. It had over 3 million viewers worldwide. So the esports segment is, again, it's a good opportunity for these sort of emerging segments and emerging platforms to really develop a new audience. I think perhaps more importantly for these sort of companies, and this goes for Joe Wicks on YouTube as well, is to widen its demographic to what it is usually tuning into that platform. So it may not just be about the millennials or the 26 to 35-year-olds, but perhaps an older or even very young demographic starting to experience this sort of content. And finally, we were also seeing on the positive side of things, new and recent SVOD service launches almost seize the positives. I think exploit is perhaps a word we shouldn't use so much at this moment in time. But we've seen Disney Plus launch to incredible success here in the UK on the 24th of March. We've also seen it coincide with a new TV campaign for BritBox. So again, consumers generally have a little bit more time on their hands. There's competition for media and video service like we've never seen before. So we expect to see across all services, particularly streaming subscription services, at least a short-term uptick in these subscribers. Now, if we look at this in terms of consumption, if we go around the clock here, in terms of consumption, generally speaking, pretty much every sector has seen an increase since the lockdown. Free-to-air broadcasts has increased. We've seen some incredible successes. Ant&Deck's Saturday Night Takeaway achieved almost 11 million audience at its peak viewing. I think that's the best for the show and the highest rating we've seen so far this year. So it still remains incredibly relevant, particularly for those public service broadcasters. On the broadcaster VOD side, so by BVOD, I'm referring to the likes of iPlayer, ITV Hub, All4, and 5 On Demand. And again, we've seen a marked increase in consumption. I think it's fair to say that we will see consumers appreciate the depth of some of these broadcaster VOD services as they get more familiar with them during this lockdown. So again, we've seen some pretty impressive successes and viewing figures on these platforms. I mentioned Disney Plus on the SVOD side or subscription VOD side. It's not just Disney Plus. We will see lots of BritBox increase their subscribers more than they would have previous to the lockdown. The likes of the established services like Amazon Prime Video, Netflix, Now TV will all also see an increase in subscribers. So for that sector overall, it's perhaps one which will benefit most in terms of top-line revenue. But consumption is considerably up. I mentioned YouTube and social media video. It's not just standing in front of a screen doing workouts. It's just the snacking, the 1-2 minute clips. People are wanting to stay connected with their outside world, with their friends, with their peers. So YouTube and social media video will continue to grow as well. Now, there are a couple of areas which have seen a decline, not least on the cinema side. We expect to see a major drop-off in cinema admissions and box office revenue this year, simply because with the cinemas being closed and titles being pushed back, it's going to be tricky to make this up in the second half of this year. However, we will see some sort of correction in 2021. However, it's unlikely to be at the levels what we witnessed in 2019. That has presented an opportunity in the home video market, however. As you would expect, the DVD and Blu-ray market continues to decline. In fact, will decline more than previously just because the retailers are closed. Mail order clearly isn't making up for this. Well, this, again, has provided a real opportunity, particularly for the Hollywood studios, to push their titles digitally for digital purchase or rental. So there's two ways in which they're benefiting here. Firstly, just the stay-at-home mentality and the lockdown has meant that consumers, generally speaking, have been exposed to more digital content, whether it's on Amazon Video, whether it's on iTunes, on Sky Store, than there were previously. And secondly, some studios, notably Universal to date, actually, have brought some of their releases forward from the digital sell-through model more into the theatrical window. And the highest profile title you may have seen is Trolls World Tour, which was due to be released, I think, last week at the beginning of Easter in cinemas. Instead, which has pretty much been an unprecedented step, Universal has made the title available for a 48-hour pay-per-view video on demand view for $15.99 across all platforms, whether that's iTunes, Sky Store, Google, or Amazon Video. So it's going to be very interesting to see over the next 3 to 4 months what knock-on effect that has on sales further down the window. So usually it would be a 3-month window. What's the impact on that window in the longer term? And then the pay TV side, this is perhaps one which is a little bit more difficult to call. Whilst we've seen an increase in viewing across all other platforms, obviously the lack of sports content may mean we may see a decline in pay TV viewing in the near term. We may see an uplift because more people at home. That's the bit we're a little bit unsure of right now. But clearly that's in an industry which has perhaps been hit more so than others. It's got the double whammy of lower advertising revenues and a lower ARPU, at least in the short term, due to the reduction in that sports coverage. Now, from a revenue point of view, because of the impact from advertising, we expect to see a further decline in free-to-air broadcast revenues this year. In most free-to-air broadcasters across the world, or most established ones, they've been pretty marginally either flat or 1% decline year on year in the last couple of years. However, we expect to see that decline at a much steeper rate this year. As we've already seen, the likes of ITV, Channel 4, plus the likes of Comcast and Telia have all issued statements saying that it will detrimentally impact their advertising revenues this year. BVOD, again, perhaps a difficult one to call. We have this as a decline, but largely because the impact of advertising revenues and brands not spending much on advertising in the short term. However, consumption is going to be markedly up, so it'd be interesting to see if this ends up being a decline or if the increase in views is enough to offset that decline in overall advertising rates. And on subscription video on demand, as you would expect, we will see significant increase in streaming revenue over the coming months. As you can see across everything else, apart from digital purchase and rental, we expect to see an overall decline in revenue, again, partly due to advertising with YouTube and social media. Has anyone got any questions today? Anything we can add, Richard?
David, yeah, we've got a few questions that come in on the screen, but also, Kauser, we were talking earlier, we were talking about kind of changes in demographics and also changes in the kind of types of content that people are watching. Personally, I've started watching Twin, so my Norwegian's improving day by day. I think by episode 8 I'll be fluent. But this situation does force us into or tease us into watching different types of content. I mean, what's your view on that, Karen?
Well, yeah. I mean, we know that TV viewing is surging, as David pointed out in one of his earlier slides. We know from ITV's reporting and the BBC's reporting about Killing Eve just now that there was a 78% uplift in viewing over the last month. Yeah, people are watching more TV. Yeah, and for now, I think it's going to be interesting to see how our habits evolve. Yeah, and whether we, as David said earlier, discover new content, new genres. But is there also a danger at some point of TV fatigue kicking in? Yeah, depending on how long all of this goes on, are we going to end up exhausting all of the catalogues of the broadcasters and the pay TV services? So that's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out, particularly because obviously the content producers like Netflix and Amazon can't currently make any content. So there is that possibility, I guess, in maybe 3 to 6 months. Even longer term than that is the question of how people's budgets, new budgets after this is all over, how they're going to be recalibrated to different needs. In other words, are people going to be able to spend the same money on TV and OTT services? Sorry, that all sounded very negative, didn't it? Yeah, but we're looking longer term now.
I think there's some upsides to this as well. We've got to try and look at this from a positive perspective. A couple of questions that have come in, 2 in particular around commissioning. So one from Fiona Gillies. Do you see the pandemic as an opportunity to fundamentally change some of the traditional ways the industry operates, i.e. transforming the way content is commissioning? And I'll add to that one from Christine, I think it's Christine Hartland from Patchwork Production. It'd be interesting to find out if COVID-19 will have an effect regarding commissioning more diverse content. So 2 questions there on kind of commissioning. I don't know if either of you particularly want to answer those.
Well, I think there's going to be definitely a content boom once this is all over. Yeah, I think that now is the time to get your scripts into Netflix and Amazon, because when social distancing rules have been relaxed sufficiently, they will be rather commissioning lots and lots of new content. So, I mean, I think that's definitely going to happen. In terms of the way that content has been commissioned right now, well, I mean, it's interesting. David mentioned Joe Wicks. I don't know if you guys have seen the Jamie Oliver cooking show as well on Channel 4, where there's no crew anymore. It's being filmed from Jamie Oliver's home, one of his homes, and it's him and his wife. His wife is the camera woman, on this. So I guess that's a very small example of innovations in the way that content is being produced and filmed. David?
Yeah, I agree. I think what we'll see is perhaps I guess you could argue this is an experimental phase, and some things will stick and some won't. So whether we see a mix in the different types of content, whether we revert back to normal in the longer term, I think there is perhaps a danger, obviously, when we're out of lockdown, that obviously we are expected to go into recession. It's going to take a good few months to get back to anywhere near normal. So will we see that same investment we saw previously into production and also commissioning? I think, there will be perhaps a little bit of hesitancy. Perhaps there will be a little bit more caretaking with regards to the commissioning process, to what content certain broadcasters take in the near term. I think over the longer term, you would hope that we return to a little bit of normality there. But I agree. I think there will be this content production boom. I think there might be a little bit of caution, at least in Q3 and Q4 relating to this.
Yeah.
Go on, Kauser.
No, I was just going to say, as to the sort of diversity of content, what's going to be interesting after social distancing and self-isolation has been relaxed, and actually eventually when we do fully come out of this, it's going to be interesting to know what genres of content is commissioned. Will this pandemic have any effect, at least in the first, say, year or two, about us wanting to watch less dark dramas? Will we want to watch more comedy, for example, more escapism? So that's going to be interesting. I guess, we need to talk to some film studios and content producers and content commissioners, indeed, about what kind of content they're going to be looking for and commissioning.
Good. On the subject of drama, Charles Dawes, hello Charles, from TiVo, is concerned that we're going to run out of new drama. I'm conscious that a lot of people have brought releases forward in many ways. Do you think we're going to run out of new drama? Is there enough in the pipeline to keep us going for a while?
Yeah,
we are.
Yeah, sorry, Kauser.
Sorry, David. I was just going to say we are almost certainly going to run out of drama, depending on how long this goes on. So primetime content, there was a really interesting piece from in the Times on Saturday, and it quotes Channel 4, ITV, the BBC, and Sky. And they've talked to people like Charlotte Moore at the BBC and Ian Katz at Channel 4, rather than Charlotte Moore at the BBC, about content like EastEnders, but also Line of Duty and some of the other big shows. And Ian Katz said, yeah, we're going to have issues, basically, depending on how long this goes on.
David, anything to add?
Yeah, I think that's big. I think, we're sort of assuming, around a 3-month lockdown. I think, beyond that, that's when I think it will get tricky. I think within the 3-month period, there's probably enough content where you can manage those viewer expectations, perhaps be a bit clever with the schedule. And this just doesn't relate to broadcasters; it relates to Netflix as well. Beyond that, it's obviously going to get increasingly challenging to do that. I think they are going to run out of new content. So then it's a question of being clever with your library content, your catalogue content, but also perhaps further experimentation with new live or non-drama formats.
Excellent. I'll take a few questions. I better take one from my boss, Simon Fell, the chairman of the DTG. Clearly asking some very interesting questions. And the first one is, how many online subscriptions can the UK consumer stand to pay for? I know we've had numbers pre-coronavirus that there was a kind of a sensible cap of around 3. I guess that might be changed. And do either of you have a view? David?
We've got some charts coming up, so I'll get to those. But just summarising really, we're at about 2 now in the UK. Per SVOD household, they're taking about 2 services. So I'm including like Netflix, Amazon Prime, BritBox, Disney Plus in there. We feel in the UK that it'll probably trend more towards 3 now. In our survey we took at Christmas, the majority of SVOD subscribers suggested that they would be happy to take another service in 2020. And in fact, the more services people had, the more likely they were to take another service this year. So it's interesting because I think people will take more in the short term. In the longer term, we might see that service hopping. So people dipping in and out of services. Really, consumers becoming more savvy as to how they manage their subscription services. But at this stage, or certainly pre-COVID, we weren't really seeing that saturation. There's certainly a lot of headroom to go in the market.
Good. I'll take 2 more questions, then we'll get on to the second part of the slide pack, if that's okay. One from Sean Donegan from Irish Music Rights Organisation. He's kind of questioning if consumption's going up, viewerships are going up, why aren't we seeing advertisers seeing the value in targeting those large audiences? He's asked that one to you, David, in particular.
Yeah, I think it's simply because the brands are obviously being a lot more cautious and people aren't spending money. I think it just boils down to the consumer environment right now. I think that may change. As soon as we're out of lockdown, we might see a shift again. I think, clearly the economic situation, we saw the doom and gloom scenario yesterday, at least in the short term. And I think until that changes, there's going to be a significant amount of caution there. So unfortunately, that those audiences won't relate to direct significant revenues in the short term.
Final one, maybe Kauser, you could answer this, again from Simon Fell. What do you think the long-term impact on the cinema business will be now that studios are contemplating selling more movies straight to Netflix or Amazon, so skipping the big screen release?
Longer term, I don't think. Well, interesting. It depends, I guess, on how you define longer term. I suppose, and the other question is here that do the cinemas want a direct relationship with cinema goers? Yeah, do they want to own that relationship, or are studios happy for the cinemas to be the go-between? And cinemas are an experience. Yeah, going to watch something on the big screen and buying popcorn, overpriced popcorn, and chocolates and sweets and Coca-Cola and things like that. It's all part of the experience. So I don't know that there will be much longer-term effect, but I'm talking longer-term to me means in the next 5 years, let's say. Yeah, I think that people will be desperate to get back to cinemas once social distancing is over and a vaccine has been found and we can all feel safe in each other's company again. That's just my personal view. I haven't looked at any data on this specifically. Probably I can do that and come back with a better answer next week, perhaps.
Yeah, I do think there's a theory that we're all going to be so tired of being locked away that we're going to bounce back and go out every day of the week, but that's yet to be seen. Great, yeah. Thank you very much for the questions. Keep the questions coming. David, you've got a few more slides to take us through. Shall I hand back to you?
Yeah, problem. I think on the box office part as well, I think, there is a danger that we come out of lockdown in the height of summer, which isn't necessarily going to be ideal for people wanting to go to a dark cinema. We have seen it's still a $40 billion industry worldwide. Revenues, box office spend continues to go up year on year, and we've seen that widening of the demographic again. So I feel box office is here to stay for the longer term. We will always see moves, perhaps from the studios, to to play with windows, but that's it's a very complicated relationship they have with the theatre owners. So once this is over, the Trolls example I mentioned previously, we don't expect those sort of initiatives in markets like the UK and the US in particular, and in Western markets, to become commonplace beyond the lockdown. We think it's very much them effectively seizing the opportunity right now. But yeah, we do feel that the theatres and cinemas will become or will remain relevant very much for the long term.
And it's super lucrative too to keep the status quo as it is, because every time there is a different pay window, the sort of various distribution slivers make more money ultimately for the content producer.
Totally agree. Okay.
Good. We've got a new Bond movie, No Time to Die, coming out as well, haven't we? So we'll have something to go to the cinema to see.
Yeah, there's going to be a plethora of delayed movies coming out, so it is good. Some good news there. Okay, so just looking at our global forecast, we've done a few models really of the different sectors on a global basis, and these expectations are continuing to evolve. On the TV advertising side, we expect to see at least a 10% decline this year globally. Could be more. We've seen some stats suggest that the US market would be down around 13% per year. But obviously, at the moment, these are sort of early indications. It's going to be a while before we get a true read on that. On the pay TV side, we're already looking at a sort of marginal decline on pay TV revenues globally. We expect to see that to worsen to around that sort of 8 to 9% decline. Again, this doesn't include advertising revenues. The main issue here with pay TV, as I mentioned previously, is that decline in ARPU due to sports. Now, for example, in the UK, our estimate is that over 40% of pay TV subscribers take a sports package. So whilst they've got that break from sports, then clearly that's going to have a knock-on effect. Subscribers, in terms of subscribers, we will see a little bit more subscriber attrition, but not massively. We do feel that it perhaps will be fairly robust in the short term. But again, overall, particularly in markets like the US, we are seeing traditional pay TV subscribers sort of fall at that 3-4% per year mark. And that was prior to COVID. SVOD, our view now is that we'll hit at least 30% growth this year. That's up from about 25% previously. This could be even higher. As I'll talk about shortly, one of the key challenges for these SVOD players in the second half of the year is retaining those subscribers. So all the new subscribers they've gained during this last quarter is making sure they stay to the end of the year and keep paying their monthly subscriptions is key. And then digital purchase and rentals, the likes of Trolls and things like The Invisible Man in the early window, plus consumers being at home more. We're seeing this increase to, we're forecasting now around 15% growth from 9 to 10% growth previously. So just touching on the streaming subscriptions, I think, Disney perhaps got a little bit fortunate with the timing of their service. But if we just go back to the end of 2019, as you can see, year on year, that continued growth across the main three services, Now TV, Amazon Prime and Netflix. We are looking now at over 11 million subscribers, I think, for Netflix at the end of last year, perhaps even more. It will have added even more during this year. And interestingly, Netflix is the one that, even though it's the largest, it's the one that adds more subscribers than any other year on year. In fact, 2019 was one of its best years yet in terms of subscriber additions. Also interesting on this chart is the role of others. You see a big jump in others. And in 2019, we saw good growth in ITV Plus. BritBox launched towards the end of the year. You had Hayu as well, which continued its momentum. And then Apple TV Plus, which, through its bundling with new Apple devices, has already achieved a fairly sizable base. And now in 2020, as I mentioned before, we're probably looking at 5 to 6 million new subs in 2020 in lockdown. And Disney Plus is key to this, as we'll talk about on the next slide. So 2020, even though as we mentioned previously, we're already reaching those heady heights of half of all households having SVOD. So that's around 14 million subscriptions. So households, 25 million subscriptions. There's still significant room to grow. If we look at Disney Plus already, despite being only available for, I think, 3 weeks now, it's the third largest SVOD service in the UK. We estimate it's got up to 4 million subscribers already. Our forecast pre-COVID for the end of the year was approaching 3 million. So we think this situation has perhaps added at least another 1 million subscribers. It's an incredibly good value service. It's only $5.99 for devices. It's not only has it got new content on there like The Mandalorian, it's effectively got the whole Disney catalogue available. So it's incredibly appealing to consumers. And when we've done our research in December, we asked intenders, but also existing subscribers in the US why they signed up. And it was interesting in the mix. It wasn't one factor in terms of content. It was that library content, those classic Disney movies, as well as the new release movies and the new content. So the key thing for Disney is keeping those consumers in beyond the lockdown, but also generally, regardless of the current situation, is how does it keep those consumers locked in? So in the US, we've seen the likes of Frozen 2 and Onward, which never actually made it to the cinemas here in the UK. We've seen those released already onto the service. So again, perhaps a little bit indicative of lockdown, but it has those tricks up its sleeves. Also, let's remember as well that there's a significant proportion of Disney Plus subscribers who are either on annual contracts. In the UK, for example, they had I think it's a $49.99 annual package if you signed up for a year. Also, you've got the deal with O2 as well. So people bundling for a minimum of 6 months on that service. So it is, whilst there is that danger of it losing subscribers or losing some of these new subscribers, it's perhaps not as exposed as you would first think to that, particularly in the second half of the year. So Disney Plus, we expect it to help drive that multiple subscriptions, and UK SVOD subscribers UK SVOD households over 55% of UK households this year. So we'll now exceed pay TV. Now I know there were some stats going around a couple of years ago saying that SVOD exceeded pay TV, but that was a total of subscriptions, not subscribing households. So by the end of 2020, we estimate that each SVOD household would have around 2 services. Now that's up from around 1.5, 2 years ago. In fact, we could see easily exceed that. And again, so it's clear that we've seen it in the US, the Disney Plus subscribers in the US, I think over 90% of Disney Plus subscribers in the US already have Netflix. So is that familiarity? If you look at these services listed here, they're all very much complementary. On the whole, the content is very, very different. So being able to package up your own content into these different services is becoming increasingly appealing for consumers. So begs the question, is there a need for super aggregators? That could be Sky, it could be likes of Amazon, Google. That is an entirely different topic altogether. We're happy to talk about that in more detail at another time. So in terms of overall traffic, what I think is really evident here is that despite all the, all the concerns about all this additional content and what impact that's going to have on the networks, actually to date, the networks have coped very well indeed. We had very early on the likes of Netflix, Amazon Prime, YouTube, Apple TV, all reduced their bit rates. Netflix specified it was 25%. YouTube were also specific in saying that they defaulted to SD, just to lighten the load on the network. Now, it could be argued, I think, given what we've seen since, was that actually necessary? Would it matter if these reduce their bit rates to these levels? Already consumers are used to adaptive bit rate streaming anyway, so would it have had a major impact if they'd have kept them the same? As I mentioned previously, BT broadband traffic's up 45%. The various sources and estimates and consumer surveys, we're looking at perhaps around 60% increase in the total amount of content watched across all streamed services. And things like Steam as well on the gaming side. Let's not forget the competing technologies. It's not just video, it's music streaming, but increasingly we've seen huge growth in online gaming and esports. Steam hit 20 million concurrent users for the first time. So overall, we're seeing pretty good reliability on those networks. If you look at BT, I think this was quoted in a BBC article a couple of weeks ago. Prior to the COVID outbreak, the daytime typically, the peak data rates was around 5 terabits per second. During COVID, we've seen pretty much a 50% increase in that peak data rate. But the highest recorded on BT, which it claims it coped with well anyway, is 17.5. And that was a particular evening where they had a lot of live sports being streamed, a lot of online gaming going on. So as you can see, there's significant headroom to grow there. So really, we're not seeing that strain on those networks to date. So I think that one of the key things here is, it does beg the question, and it's a question which the industry has asked for many years, is what would happen if the whole industry and the whole broadcast industry went to IP? Well, I think this is a fairly good acid test of where we are in that evolution. Clearly that scenario would require significant further investment, but perhaps it is a good acid test as to where we're at in the overall evolution, and maybe it could bring that further forward and reduce that timeline across the next sort of 5, 10, 15 years or longer. In terms of impact on internet speeds overall, and these are speed tests run by Ookla. These are speeds actually going to the household, so it's not within the household. Usage on Wi-Fi, etc., does have an impact on this. But overall, the contention on the network has again been pretty steady. On the broadband networks, we're only seeing a 1% decline. On the mobile networks, 3.6% decline. So in the grand scheme of things, the overall speed across different territories has actually, again, been pretty robust. Now, I mentioned previously, perhaps one thing which is a little bit more difficult to judge is the contention on people's home networks, in particular on their home Wi-Fi networks. When you've got everyone at home streaming different things on different devices at once, perhaps more regularly than usual, we may see a little bit of impact on those speeds on those individual devices. So finally, just looking at the last few slides now, in terms of overall viewing, now this is a view from our 2018 Live Digital survey and comparing that to the survey when we repeated it in 2019 in December. It's not a particularly scientific question. For us, it's a really useful barometer to see how consumers are breaking up their time. So we ask consumers in a typical week, what are the platforms? How would they split 100 hours of viewing time? What we've seen is that reduction in viewing on live TV over the year. We've seen an increase in viewing on SVOD across all demographics. Also a decrease in content viewed on a DVR. Perhaps that's been cannibalized a little bit by both the SVOD and the broadcaster VOD services. Now, in the under 25s, we do feel that this current scenario perhaps places even further reliance on streaming. Now, also in that 36 to 65-year-old age group, we expect to see further fragmentation across different viewing types. Perhaps more streaming on different types of platforms to what they were used to previously. And if I just look at the previous slide, so this is taking the 2019 data and breaking it out by age group. It is interesting to see, the overall trend. Generally speaking, the older the consumer is, the more reliant and more time they spend watching free live TV, whereas the opposite is true in the younger age groups. In fact, in that youngest of age groups, 16 to 18, you'll see that YouTube is actually at 26%. It dominates. Then it drops off when they hit 18, 19. But S4 across the board, we've seen growth across all those different categories. BVOD viewing is actually fairly significant even in the older demographics. But what we perhaps will see across the coming months and when the lockdown ends is that some of this behaviour from these older demographics will continue through. I think this is providing a good opportunity for a range of demographics to experience different platforms, different services to what they did previously. So again, will it accelerate that shift to on-demand and streaming or even simulcast in older demographics, which perhaps we're seeing much more of a steadier shift across the medium term. So finally, beyond COVID-19, what happens when we're out of this lockdown? Well, we do expect to see an overall steady recovery, both in terms of markets, but overall revenue. We expect that recession will see the impact linger into 2021. So we're not going to see an obvious immediate change in terms of the revenues flowing into the industry. Consumer behaviour, we feel, may change more significantly, but again, we expect to see a lot of these behaviours carried over once they're out of lockdown. We expect to see TV advertising, pay TV subscription revenues boost in 2021. You could almost say a little bit of a correction, but we would expect it still to be below 2019 levels. I mentioned previously, generally speaking, the entertainment industry has historically been recession-proof. When we've seen major recessions previously, pretty much all sectors have weathered this pretty well. But I think we are perhaps at a different stage now. There are free and cheap alternatives out there to buying DVDs or paying for pay TV subscriptions to what they're previously. The likes of the BVOD services, the iPlayers, ITV hubs, etc. Also, even things like YouTube, for example. Also, password sharing. We would expect to see an increase in password sharing on key streaming services over the coming months. So there is a difference this time around to what it was previously. Having said that, we do expect consumers to continue to subscribe to a number of different services, whether that's pay TV. Perhaps they don't want the lock-in, so we may see an uplift in Now TV. But on streaming services such as Netflix, Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, we expect to see most consumers to stick with those services in the short term. However, because these are pretty fluid, there's no contract, we could see some fluidity in the second half of this year.
David, you mentioned password sharing. One of the questions that's come in is piracy. I noticed on your slides, piracy was kind of 2% every year. Do you think this is going to force more risks and innovation with things like piracy, password sharing, content protection challenges, all in all?
And I think across the board, whether it is legal services or pirate services, I think we will see consumers become intrigued once again and experiment once again. However, I would say piracy overall has reached a level which, for most people, for the majority of the population, isn't on their radar as it was previously. And I know one of the big areas of concern of late has been on the sports side. I think beyond that, we've seen a huge influx of alternative services and legal services which have addressed some of the issues there. So on the piracy side, I think we may see an increase, a natural increase in consumption, but I don't think it's still going to be anywhere near the levels where it was previously or compared to the legal streaming side. On password sharing, the likes of Netflix, we're already seeing around, I think, 40 to 50% of Netflix subscribers share a password with someone outside their household. I think at least in the short term, we may see those increase a little bit. But overall, we don't think that will impact overall subscription growth, at least in the short term. But beyond, I think when we hit a recession, this will be unknown territory. We've not been in recession where we've got so many different streaming services. So it will be interesting to see how people's behaviour changes if the purse strings become tighter.
Good.
No problem. Okay, so further on, we touched on this earlier. I think the production, it certainly impacts wider streaming services from Q4. Obviously, broadcast it's going to impact much earlier. We do expect that production boom, and we also expect perhaps a sports reschedule headache. It's a very difficult one to call at this moment in time. But like I said, perhaps there will be a little bit more caution because of reduced production budgets for the remainder of this year and perhaps beyond towards that commissioning process. I mentioned previously, all the SVOD services see subscriber retention as key in the second half of this year. Effectively, as all this done, as this situation, is it just brought those intenders forward? Is it made them subscribe to these services earlier than they would have previously anticipated? So it's going to be incredibly important for these services to do all they can to retain those while still showing overall subscriber growth. At the end of the day, the likes of Netflix and Disney Plus are going to have to post quarter-on-quarter increases in subscribers to keep Wall Street happy. And multiple SVOD now is still commonplace, and we expect it to increase. I think within sort of 3 to 4 years, it's going to be pretty common for people to take at least 3 to 4 services. Having said that, as I mentioned before, we will see that trend towards 3. I mentioned about that streaming video behaviour to carry through for many. I think one of the most interesting parts of this is the fragmentation viewing, particularly amongst the perhaps slightly older demographic who are more reliant on live TV. That fragmentation and diverse behaviour across all the different video platforms, whether it's YouTube or BVOD or SVOD and live TV, what this situation will force on many people is it will open their eyes to this wider environment. So we perhaps see more fragmented viewing in the second half of this year and beyond. I think one other area which is being well documented is, despite the growth in streaming, I think it's fair to say that a lot of the streaming consumption has driven overall content consumption during this period. That the public service broadcaster role remains as crucial as ever. I think, firstly, due to that trust, particularly when it comes to the current affairs and the news content, but also that familiarity as well. A lot of people are seeking that familiarity in those uncertain times. We're seeing the same with radio consumption. So it's just that assurance really that people need at this moment in time. So I think it's been, despite obviously the concerns regarding the commercial models in the short term, for this industry, it's perhaps been good for the profile of many of these PSBs. And finally, the networks can cope. They've proven they can cope. So does this further accelerate IP delivery when it comes to broadcasting solutions? Will we see those potential, utopia solutions which may have been 20 years away? Does that timeline come further forward now because there is a proven test case? Okay. Well, thank you very much. I don't know if we've got time for any more questions, Richard.
Yeah, we've got a few minutes for some more questions. I wanted to go to Kauser first, actually. Is there a kind of... Consumers got a lot of time on their hands. They've got a wide choice of platforms. The networks seem to be holding up reasonably well. Incidentally, I had to go out and buy a 5G home hub. So I'm finding a way around it, so I think people will do. Where do you think the innovation is making a big difference in driving people towards different types of platforms or different types of content? Kauser?
Well, what sort of innovation? Sorry.
Well, are there any particularly good techniques being used by any of the streaming platforms in particular that are helping to either draw in more or new viewers or hold them?
Good question. If you look at different consumer types for each VOD service, you can almost do a pyramid, actually, of... right, let me rephrase this. The biggest players, so we're talking about Apple, Netflix, Disney, they come with other constituencies, and Sky as well. They come with other constituencies. They're not just aiming their marketing at serendipitous users or people who are impulse buyers of their subscriptions. So Disney, for example, comes with a massive constituency of children, and also of people that visit its theme parks. Sky comes with a massive constituency of people that are already satellite customers who can be converted over to streaming Now TV customers. Apple comes with embedded customers, which is all the people that have Apple phones, for example. Google comes with embedded customers of people who are using Android devices. So, they're the way that they go about customer acquisition is not just, as I say, aiming at impulse buyers, although there is an element of that. It's also looking at their existing customers and trying to upsell them effectively. Does that answer your question? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think so. One final question, I think, to both David and Kauser, before we close the session, is if you kind of, in a way, we're in the very early stages of the impact of COVID-19, and people have kind of gone through a resolve to try and stick out their business and do everything they can. Most companies at the moment are in a resilience mode. And then we're going to kind of go through a return to work mode, which is going to be complex, possibly reimagining the future. And then there might be some final reforms. I guess so my final question to both of you, which ones of these trends do you think are going to hold and we should really pay attention to? And which ones do you think are transient and probably less important longer term? Kauser, do you want to try that one first?
Yeah, I think that there's going to be more innovation in content production, for sure. I think that companies that provide animation and special effects and things like that to existing studios, I think they're going to have a heyday. Yeah, because hopefully, fingers crossed, this never happens again in our lifetimes where we are affected by a pandemic. But in case it does, then people that can still continue producing content without having live crews and live actors, I think that's going to be a boon for them. I think that also that depending on how long this goes, I think there is a danger of TV fatigue. Yeah, so I think this massive uplift that we've seen in TV viewing right now, both linear and OTT, I think that there is a probability that, again, depending on how long this all goes, that it will plateau off. And then after that, the question is, how quickly can new content be injected back into the system? Commercially, I think that sorry, I was just going to say last bit is that commercially, I think that there are some broadcasters that, as you say, everybody's in resilience mode right now. But because linear revenues are decreasing anyway, they've been decreasing by about 4% a year for the last 6 years, and then not having big shows like The X Factor and Love Island and the European Football Championships, specifically for ITV, this is a big hit to their linear advertising revenue. And it's replicated in other broadcasters worldwide. So I think there is a problem that needs to be addressed there, but obviously they can't address it yet.
Yeah, someone's made a comment on the question saying, of course, one of the greatest innovations so far is that loads of people are giving free content away. It's always easy to give free stuff away, but like the old days. David, the last word, which innovations do you think are going to stick and we should really watch?
I think for me, just going back to your previous point, is one of the things I think what will stick, and it's not necessarily an innovation, but I just think that element of diversity. I think consumers and viewers are perhaps exposing themselves to a wider range of platforms, of genres, of services, of channels than there were previously. And I think, like with everything, some things they'll like and some things they won't. But I think the ones they do, I think they will stick with. So I think what this will serve to do, this lockdown, is just fragment the industry even further across a wider range of demographics, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because if that's fragmented, then they could be targeted more easily. Perhaps we will see, almost a reinvention of advertising beyond this, because that advertising industry is going to have to do something to really try and make up that shortfall in revenue it's seen this year. So I think for me, the biggest innovation will be just the overall environment, which is driving that new diversity of viewing to sort of levels where we've not seen it before. And I think that will to some extent carry on through beyond this lockdown.
Thank you very much. Well, it just leaves me to thank so many of you for joining us this afternoon and sticking with us, which I think is the best compliment that could possibly be given to David. Thank you for a very, very insightful and informative set of data and interpretation of the trends. And Kauser, thank you again for joining us and adding a lot more colour and depth to the entire conversation. I'm Richard Lindsay-Davies. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon. We've got another date next week where we're going to look at viewer behaviours, and then the following week, as I said earlier, we're going to look at staycation and the impact on the consumer electronics device. And then finally, in place of our annual summit, which would have been on the 6th of May, we're going to present a set of data on the state of the nation for UK digital television innovation. And as I said earlier, that set of data wasn't particularly planned with the COVID impact, but I guess now it'll be coloured by the COVID impact and recent developments in the market, driven as much by the economics as the lockdown. So thank you again all for joining us. David, Kauser, and we'll speak to you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.